Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a question that literally changed the landscape of modern psychology. What exactly is the Stanford prison experiment? We're going to unpack the foundational story of this famous 1971 study while also digging deep into the incredibly fierce ongoing debate about whether it's actually scientifically valid. So whether you know the standard textbook version or you're totally new to the whole shebang, we're going to lay out the facts, the deep flaws, and its massive legacy. Let's get into it.
I want you to picture this for a second. Ask yourself, if you were dropped into a simulated prison environment right now, today, how would you act? Would you rebel against the authority, or would you conform to a really dark, abusive role? Would you become a sadistic guard for just $15 a day? It's a super uncomfortable question, I know, but it is the exact premise that kicked off one of the most infamous psychological studies in human history.
All right, let's set the scene. We are stepping back to August 1971. Right into the dimly lit, kind of gritty basement of Stanford University's psychology building. The whole goal here was to examine the psychological effects of becoming a prisoner or a prison guard. And the research team? Well, they were aiming for intense, visceral realism right from the jump. So the lead researcher, a guy named Philip Zimbardo, recruits 24 male college students using a surprisingly simple newspaper ad. And they were offered just $15 a day. Now, to put that into perspective, that's only about $70 today. It is honestly shocking to think about how incredibly mundane the financial stakes were, especially considering it led to such an extreme, traumatizing outcome. The initial setup was, honestly, incredibly clinical and highly controlled. Zimbardo's team carefully screened out anyone with a criminal background or any psychological issues. They specifically picked students who were totally normal and stable. And then, they literally just flipped a coin. That random coin toss was the only thing deciding if these everyday students were going to be guards wielding absolute power or prisoners completely stripped of it.
The simulation kicked off intensely to establish this massive power differential from day one. Local Palo Alto police actually showed up at the students' houses and conducted real surprise arrests. The prisoners were fingerprinted, blindfolded, and booked. They were stripped, handed these really awkward gowns, and referred to only by ID numbers, totally erasing their personal identities. Meanwhile, the guards were handed authoritative khaki uniforms and reflective silver sunglasses, to hide their eyes and completely de-individuate them.
Things rapidly and shockingly went completely off the rails. It became known as the 6 days of chaos. By day 2, the prisoners tried to rebel, and the guards literally sprayed them down with fire extinguishers. By day 5, the guards were forcing the prisoners to simulate sodomy in these humiliating camel exercises. The abuse escalated so fast and got so severe that Zimbardo had to pull the plug. He ended the intended 2-week study after just 6 days.
At the time, the psychological toll seemed absolute. Prisoner 8612, a guy named Douglas Corpy, famously suffered what looked like a total emotional breakdown within just 36 hours. Years later, he gave this quote, basically saying the guard role inherently promotes sadism and the prisoner role promotes shame. But here is where the story gets wild. Corpy actually admitted later on that he might have been faking that entire breakdown just to get out of the study early so he could study for his grad school exams. Crazy, right? And that one admission, it perfectly sets the stage for the massive debate we're about to unpack.
So, the antithesis, the modern backlash. For decades, this study was the gold standard in textbooks, undeniable proof that situations organically create evil in totally normal people. But today, a new wave of psychologists and historians are hitting the brakes and asking, was the foundational story of the Stanford prison experiment actually true?
Critics like author Thibault Letexier and journalist Ben Blum argue the study was deeply flawed by something called demand characteristics. Basically, this is when participants act the way they think the researcher wants them to act, rather than just behaving naturally. Critics dug into archival audio and argue the students were essentially play acting to please Zimbardo. Some are even going so far as to call the original findings a flat-out fraud.
Here is the core clash.
The original hypothesis claimed that situations organically and inevitably create evil behavior. Put a good apple in a bad barrel, and the barrel wins. But the modern critique completely flips this on its head. Archival recordings actually show the warden explicitly telling the guards they needed to be tough and firm. So the critics argue the basement didn't magically turn these kids evil. Explicit instructions and specific coaching did.
Modern psychologists suggest Zimbardo used a concept called identity leadership. In plain English, this means creating a shared group identity that gives people a license to abuse others for some perceived higher social purpose. Looking at it this way, the guards weren't just blindly turning into sadists. Actually, they were led to believe that being harsh was a necessary service for the scientific success of the experiment. They were doing it because they thought it was for the greater good of science.
Now, a huge piece of this modern skepticism comes from the 2001 BBC prison study. This was a televised field study that completely failed to replicate Zimbardo's findings. The contrast is literally night and day. In 1971, guards abused prisoners, but in 2001, when the researchers didn't actively coach or lead them, there was zero guard abuse. Instead, the prisoners united, got organized, and actually overpowered the guards.
These shocking archival tape revelations and the failed replications, they've sparked a literal war over the future of psychology. It's making huge headlines, it forces all of us to step back and question how we interpret institutional abuse, and honestly, whether the classic psychological studies we've trusted for 50 years are actual science or just really compelling stories.
Which brings us to the synthesis. Zimbardo strikes back. Listen, as impartial observers, we really can't talk about this backlash without looking at the other side of the coin. Until his recent passing, Philip Zimbardo vigorously defended his work, pushing back on the critics and pointing to the undeniable, lasting impact the experiment had on the world.
Zimbardo countered that the experiment was never, ever meant to be a perfect, rigid, scientific replica of a real prison. He said, and I quote, "It serves as a cautionary tale if we underestimate how social roles can influence our actions." He basically argued that obsessing over whether one specific guard was just play acting completely misses the broader, terrifying truth about how susceptible humans are to systemic pressure.
A lot of this debate boils down to a fancy academic term, ecological validity. That just means, can the findings of a study actually be applied to messy, real-life settings? Critics rightly point out that a college basement full of volunteers is nothing like an actual, complex prison system. Yet Zimbardo maintained that those core behavioral echoes, that rapid, scary shift toward authoritarianism and submissiveness, are just impossible to dismiss, even in a fake setup.
And here's the thing we absolutely have to acknowledge. Flawed or not, this experiment literally changed the real world. I mean, its findings eerily mirrored the Abu Ghraib prison abuses by U.S. military guards decades later. It was directly cited in U.S. congressional hearings on prison reform. It helped shape incredibly strict ethical guidelines for human research, and it actually helped change federal rules so juvenile detainees wouldn't be housed with adult inmates anymore. That is a massive legacy. So I'm going to leave you with this final thought to ponder. Do the deep, undeniably real scientific flaws of the Stanford prison experiment completely invalidate its terrifying reflection of human nature? Or does the complex truth lie somewhere in between? As you wrap up this explainer, I want you to consider, is this iconic study just a myth we should toss out, or is it a messy, complicated reality that we still have to learn from today? Thank you so much for exploring this with us.